Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Patrick Gagan. Everyone here up at the top has two jobs. Their real or day job, and then the other thing that they're doing. My real or day job is I teach in the Department of History here in Trinity. I'm currently the college's senior lecturer, which is kind of a dean of undergraduate studies responsible for admissions and the curriculum. My other job is as a weekend presenter of a history program on News Talk Radio, and I think it was for that reason that I was invited to moderate this today. We have two very distinguished guests. On my immediate left, we have Professor Geoffrey Rockwell, who is a visiting research fellow here in the Trinity Long Room Hub. His real or day job is that he is Professor of Philosophy and Humanities Computing at the University of Alberta in Canada. And then our other guest is Professor Curtis Wong, who is Adjunct Professor in Digital Cultural Heritage at Trinity College Dublin. He also has a real or a day job, and a real or a day job that I'm sure is much better paying than being an adjunct professor here. He's Principal Researcher in eScience at Microsoft Research in Seattle, and he's the co-creator of the Worldwide Telescope, which is an interactive virtual learning environment. And we're really here just for a conversation about, I suppose, narrative in the world of modern technology, to tease out some of the ideas. I was reading Geoffrey's book, Defining Dialogue, from Socrates to the Internet earlier today, and it made me think, well, if Socrates was alive today, would he be on Twitter? Would he be using digital media? What would he be doing? It's also funny because when I was reading about a report in the New York Times for the bicentenary of the birth of Charles Dickens, and it said that, well, if Charles Dickens was alive today, he'd certainly be watching The Wire. He may even have been spending the last 10 years writing for The Wire. And it made me wonder then what kinds of new technology would Charles Dickens be using? Because, of course, he used the media of the time and the serialized novel, and because that was the form, that's how he wrote. So would he be writing a text message novel? Would he be designing a new form of entertainment that would be perfect for the iPad? Or what would he be doing? Well, there were some of the things that were occurring to me anyway, but I thought we might just be, and we'll leave time for questions as well, and especially during it if people want to join in on some of the issues. But I thought I might start with a question to Geoffrey about narrative, because some people would suggest that maybe narrative is dead. In my own discipline in history, some people would say, well, narrative history is dead. We've taken it over with conceptual history and theoretical history. You know, is there a place for storytelling in a discipline like history? And then with these new technologies, is storytelling, narrative storytelling possible? So with all these new technologies, does it mean the death of narrative?
Doesn't mean the death. I don't think narrative is dead, but I think there's in the game studies community, there's a lot of tension between a camp that calls themselves the ludologists and the people who are taking narrative theory or literary theory and trying to apply it to games. From the perspective of the ludologists, they see, in their view, there's a whole mess of people who are trying to take old theory about old media and apply it to games, and they're completely missing out on the interactivity, game mechanics, the playful side, by insisting that narrative is important. So for one class of people, they're saying, let's just set it aside. Let's try to find ways to look at interactive media that are natural to interactive media instead of reinscribing, the theories that we've inherited. And in that sense, they want to put it to sleep for about 50 years and then wake it back up.
I was actually reading about the ludologists, and at a recent academic game studies conference, a blood feud threatened to erupt between the ludologists who wanted to see the focus shift onto the mechanics of gameplay and the narratologists who were interested in studying games alongside other storytelling media. So are you a narratologist?
No, I would say my sympathies lie more with the ludologists in the sense, but I don't. The blood feud. There's something entertaining to the blood feud. I was at a conference in which both Janet Murray, who is sort of queen of the narratologists, and Espen Aarseth, who is sort of king of the ludologists, were perfectly polite to each other. And you sometimes think that the whole point of the blood feud is to actually drive everybody else out. to sort of establish a bipolar sort of, you're either with Janet Murray or you're with Espen Arseth, but there's no third way.
So there really is a blood feud. They weren't exactly.
No. I think it is. I think it is a blood feud of convenience. It would be a little bit like you and I staging a fight here just to entertain people. That's not entirely fair.
No, we can do that.
Where in terms of narrative is, I think, very important to understanding certain types of games. In Japan, there's a type of game called visual novels that often young women play on their cell phones, and they are essentially page turners. You see a little bit of text, and you see they're very simple to make. So they're made by a lot of the doujin, the fan groups that often make games and manga and something like that. You have a couple backgrounds, and then you have a couple manga-like characters, and then you recombine them maybe with some music, and you have a game that essentially is like a page-turning game. Very few of these have been translated in English, but you cannot understand that type of game without bringing narrative theory. They are stories where you flip the page and occasionally you make a decision. A game like Metal Gear Solid 4, has the final sequence. You make two decisions. It's essentially narrative. You can think of there are these little pearls, like a necklace of interactivity, and then these long sequences of animated film. So I think narrative applies to some areas. I think the ludologists are right, though, that we need to ask about interactivity.
We were saying beforehand that Geoffrey is the person who imagines things, and Curtis is the person who actually makes it happen. So when you're working with Microsoft and you're, say, involved with the Worldwide Telescope or any of these projects, how important is narrative to you? Is that something that influences your work?
For myself, I think narrative is key to everything. What does that make me? A narratologist? I mean, because if you look at all of the work that I've been doing, and the Worldwide Telescope in particular, it's always, to me, about storytelling. Because I'm interested in the application of technology to help people learn. And my philosophy about that is that if you have a subject that somebody doesn't know anything about, you're not going to just hand them a reference book about it and expect them to pick it up and want to learn about it. I think you have to engage them about the subject to make them want to learn. And for me, that comes from story. I spent quite a bit of time at a company I used to work for 20 years ago called the Voyager Company. And we did feature films on Laserdisc and all the sort of special things you see on DVDs today. We did back then and 20 years ago with multiple commentaries and all these other supplementary materials that were there to help add context to the understanding of that film. And so, to me, spending a lot of time producing those things meant spending a lot of time with directors, usually on works that were the most important works of their career, explaining the process of storytelling and how they did it and what they were thinking about. So that background was hugely influential for me as we also began doing CD-ROMs. I produced two of the first multimedia CD-ROMs for Windows. And those projects, to me, were hugely influenced by creating CD-ROMs that were not just essentially a reference book on a disc, but opened up very much like a movie when you put it and started to just launch into this pre-title sequence, and then it would progressively reveal more, and you'd learn about people and characters and context and things like that. And to that thing about narrative, I think the holy grail to me about narrative is using technology to enable a dialogue or conversation that is malleable to your interests. And I think all the things that I've been working on, including Worldwide Telescope, are designed to emulate that. We can talk about that more later.
See, I would be open enough to seeing things like computer games as being narrative friendly, because even when you think about it, when television came along for decades, it was seen as a downward move for a top actor or actress to end up on television, whereas now some of the best work is on television. But something I was reading about computer games suggested that the trouble is that because you can die and you can try it again and you can keep trying over and over again, that is the enemy of narrative, and it disrupts it and it prevents you getting empathy with the character. So, Geoffrey, is that's something that is still going to keep it separate from television or cinema?
So the standard sort of hypertext argument is that in a hypertext or a computer game, it is the player who is making the story. In some sense, the author, there's a different relationship between author and player, but the precise sequence of events that would be the plot of the story, it's the player that is choosing those in a world of choices that are programmed and structured by the author. When you look at, so Henry Jenkins talks about emergent narratives. The narrative emerges in the playing. It's not already there, a tale that was told ages ago and is being retold. The ludologist will then say that story is really tedious for exactly the reasons. You know, you're tootling along and then you die. I mean, I'm not a very good game player. There's a point in Assassin's Creed where I cannot get past. I just die over and over and over again. It would not be a great story to tell. I may keep on doing it, but nobody wants to tell that story. So the ludologists say, well, sure, there's a narrative if you want to say there's a sequence of events, but it's a really tedious one. But that is the sort of standard story about how narrativity occurs. And what's interesting about that is it's a story that we hear coming out of the computing world about revolution and democratization. That this is transferring the power of narrative to the player, away from the Renaissance sort of big name author, and that this is democratizing. We've heard this about the web, we heard it about CD-ROMs, we heard it about personal computers, and there's a certain truth to it, that there is a democratization of control of information happening there.
And Curtis, we will be talking about things like text message novels and all these kind of new things that are allowed with the new technology. But do you think new technologies will also change how existing narratives are told?
Well, I think maybe the mechanics of how narratives are told can be influenced by technology, as it always has been since the printing press. But I think I've never really believed in the early days there were some CD-ROMs that had, multiple endings and you could sort of choose your different path, and I never found those to be very satisfying, because I believe that in a traditional narrative form, the author picks the construct of the story to make it the most meaningful and the most impactful. And games where you just sort of move through it and end up with one is just like writing a novel about your life. Most of your life is actually pretty dull. Mm-hmm. And it's that unique day when there's unusual circumstances of events that happen that make it particularly interesting. And so I think multipath games are like day-to-day life. You could do it, but it's not very interesting.
I'm thinking back to last summer when I was playing Lego Star Wars with my nephew, and if I had to try and gather some kind of coins one more time, ended up just trying to going around as Lego C-3PO. No, wasn't it good? Yeah. What about, Geoffrey, things like the text message novels? I was reading about those, and some of them became such huge business that publishers bought them and published them as a regular book, and there were movie rights being sold. And is it a gimmick, or is it something that could allow for different kinds of stories to be told?
I think that's more about being able to consume it in different venues. I think those are essentially electronic books that are convenient to consume on a portable phone or an iPad. A large number of youth spend a lot of time commuting on subways and buses and so on like that, and they've got a lot of time to listen to music and to read books and so on like that. And the text message novels, the ones I've heard about, the ones that were very popular in Japan, they seem to be things that they were popular to consume on the cell phones. And if you get on a bus in Japan, half the young girls have their cell phone open and they're playing a game or doing something on there. Nowadays, they even watch TV on their cell phones. They've got little antennas and so on. And the cars have it too, actually. You'll see cars stopped in traffic, and like 1 out of every 5 will have a TV in the front. You wonder how they don't have accidents and so on. So my sense is that those are really just books. They're just being consumed on a cell phone. and the text messaging fits with a lifestyle that a lot of youth have. So it has an episodic feature, not unlike Dickens. You get an episode and then you've got to wait. You're sort of a cliffhanger. What's going to happen next? That's my sense of the text the text message novels. What was the question behind that, though?
Well, I suppose it's kind of like when you do mention Dickens there, that I suspect Dickens would not be writing the same kinds of novels if alive now, because he wouldn't be selling them chapter by chapter, and they wouldn't be read in serial format. So would an innovative writer from the past then be using something like an iPad as a way of reaching a different audience? It might be a text message novel, but it could be something that maybe it would be you would download something on your iPad every morning and read the story that way. Would that be, Curtis, would you see that something that could develop?
I think Dickens would be writing for a television series.
So you're with the New York Times on that it would be The Wire. And what about the Socrates question? If Socrates was alive?
So I want to say about Dickens, I think he might be teaming up with some people and doing like a YouTube series. There was that great series, and I can't remember the name or anything of it, which was done when there was the writers' strike, and some
Josh Whedon's one.
No, Neil Patrick Harris.
Yeah, Josh Whedon. It was the Dr. Horrible one.
Yes, Dr.
Yeah, so that
Yeah.
one, but the main actress in that also did one, which was even lower key and less money and less high production, and but so those types of things where you team up and you're doing episodic things. In terms of Socrates, the interesting thing about Socrates is, we don't actually know what he thought. We have a remarkable writer called Plato, writing these documents about, the last oral prophet philosopher, and there's this lovely tension between a written dialogue about someone who doesn't approve about writing. And I think that what would happen now would be something similar. It would be a video game by the 21st century Plato, in which the main character was someone who really did not approve of video games, and probably he would make the argument, which has been made in the sort of ethics of gaming. One argument that is made around violence in video games is that the first-person shooters are training people to kill. You play it, and it's not unlike practicing being a soldier, and that is very similar to the argument in the Republic, where Socrates argues that we should expel the poets because the poets essentially train our youth to practice being disreputable roles, playing at cads. And we don't want our kids to practice that. We want them to practice being noble people. And so I think we would see the same thing. We would see a video game with a Socratic character who is critical of the very medium that you're playing.
Would he use Twitter?
Would he use Twitter? God, Socrates loved to embarrass important people like us, the sophists, those who get paid for professing. I think Socrates would be in the room, and at the right moment, he'd go, "Excuse me, Mr. Rockwell, I don't know much about anything, but I just have this small question about..." And he would know he was being podcast. He would be, sort of guerrilla media type. He would be subverting the official system of, people like you and I. And it'd be going out on podcasts, and then he'd develop a cult following. All these people who don't approve, who didn't get into Trinity, and therefore have this little grudge to bear, and they'd all be, friending him and so on.
Okay, so what are the other implications then when we have these new modes of storytelling? For a university like Trinity, Curtis, can this influence how we teach, how students learn? What are the implications there?
Well, I think it somewhat depends on whether you're talking about narrative or sort of expository, sort of fiction versus nonfiction. I don't think it's interactive is particularly helpful for fiction, as I mentioned earlier. But I think the new technologies are hugely helpful for education and learning. The ability to be able to, essentially in terms of text, the whole hyperlinking and the media enabled is what enabled the web to be as relevant as it is today. Being able to move between different ideas and different locations to drill in deeper is a really hugely important capability. We haven't seen that yet with video. Video is very much a very powerful form, but it's very monolithic. You can't hyperlink out of a video because a video is just a bunch of pictures. But the work that I did on the Worldwide Telescope it's about the universe, but my secret agenda in it was to create these things that are called guided tours, which look like video. So they're produced paths within this virtual environment that are rendered in video in real time. But at any point, if you see something interesting, you can pause that. Essentially, it's like being on a tour bus. You're being driven somewhere, and you see something interesting. You can stop the bus, get on, and maybe you see something interesting, and get on a different tour bus and continue going that way, or you can go back in your own bus and continue where you were going, or you can stop and get more information about something. And I think that capability of interactively being able to explore the things of your choosing through things that have the leverage of a very powerful medium that looks like video or storytelling with a good writer behind it, I think is a huge potential advantage for education going forward.
Yeah, I saw a presentation that you gave on the Worldwide Telescope on YouTube, and it was showing the universe and various different things. So would it be that you would have lots of different boxes, and then the person can decide to click on what catches their interest and explore that?
Say I was wanting to learn about the creation of stars and solar systems. You'd start with large clouds of hydrogen gas, and they'd show you different stages of the evolution. But say if you got to the point of when stars are older, and they talk about planetary nebula, which is a remnant of an older star, you could sort of drill in and find out other tours that relate specifically to that thing, or you could go further on in the evolution of what happens when stars finally die.
Okay, now, what about a contrary position to this? Because one thing that I find, say in history, say back in the 1940s, you might only have 3 books on Abraham Lincoln, and everyone would read those books and they would master those 3 books. Now we have amazing resources online and journal articles and books you can get online and books in the library. So now students won't read probably even 1 book of Abraham Lincoln cover to cover, but they will be able to reference 20 books where they've looked at a couple of pages and they've Google searched to find the key word, an essay on the assassination, and they just read the pages. Is there a danger that if you had a kind of a worldwide telescope on Abraham Lincoln's life, that the students would focus on the bits that were bright and flashy? So they might focus in on the assassination, and then that would lead them to links about JFK's assassination and other American presidential assassinations, but that at the end of a 3-hour process, they won't have got the narrative from beginning to end. They'll have got 3 hours of what they're interested in.
You could argue that from both sides. You can argue that we should maintain the discipline of long-form, in-depth studies about a particular subject. And then you can also argue that students that know quite a bit about things, that they want to be able to progress as quickly and directly in the things that they're interested in. And from that, they'll get a larger context of understanding than just sort of one view. I think both are probably valid.
Yeah, I heard something that on regular websites where it's just purely text and not any images, it's 3 seconds can be the average where people will, before they'll click on to something else.
That's what it's brought us. Our attention span, both in terms of commercials, programming on the web, how much people are seeing, has gone down dramatically. So I think the average time spent in a museum on a work of art, I think, is like 90 seconds. They spend about 60 of it reading captions. They look at the work and then they move on. The videos on YouTube, if it's more than like 3 or 4 minutes, most people don't watch much more than that. So how do you remedy learning when attention spans continue to shrink?
So one can help asking, though, the question of, is reading a book the same as learning? It could be that we're coming out of a sort of bibliophilic 4 or 5 centuries where we confused learning with reading a book. Like, have you ever seen someone swim after reading a book? They read the book, they get in the water, and they drown. Reading a book is not always the best way to learn how to do certain things. You want to learn how to fly a plane. Microsoft flight simulator is probably going to be a lot more useful to you than reading a book. So we in the academy, and I'm as guilty of this as the next person, have to ask whether or not we've confused the, are we in the business of transportation or are we in the business of horse and buggies? So I'm just presenting the counter-argument. I think the way you want to frame the argument is not around books, but is around sustained argumentation. Mm-hmm. And if you frame it that way, one of the interesting fallouts of that is that the kids who are playing the computer games are probably doing more sustained. They're spending more time on Metal Gear Solid 4, staying up 24 hours, 36 hours. I mean, there are kids who actually die in internet cafes because they don't hydrate enough. They are so focused on World of Warcraft. So certain types of interactive media seem to be able to get the attention and sustain the attention, and kids will stick with it in what you could argue is a sustained argument. I interviewed one of the earlier developers at Nintendo, and he talked about how they actually, their goal, when they saw how Atari tanked, and this is early 80s, the NES, in Japan it was called the Famicom, but the NES, they're trying to make sure that they do not have a crash similar to that. Their goal was to do the usability studies to figure out how to keep youth attention for sustained periods of time, and the use of rewards and rewards that you get fewer and fewer and different things to keep that. So I think it's possible to use new media for sustained argumentation.
Because students do learn in different ways, and in the past maybe we've neglected students who are more visual learners, and everything is focused on text and...
Yeah, I mean, the more senses you involve in the process of learning, the more the mental model you can build that sustains both memory but also other relevant facts as part of validating that model.
But if I can add another thing, where narrative I think comes back in is every narrative has a storyteller, and part of listening to a story is the character of the storyteller, usually a reliable narrator, sometimes unreliable, and so on like that. I think one of the things that is important in education is not just the transmission of information, but the human dialogue and conveying of information, a human instructor at the other end of it, so to speak. I think one of the things that students are intrigued by is they're trying to figure out if they want to be the sort of person who knows something. And when you stand up, whether you're lecturing or running a small seminar, one of the things that you're doing is trying to show them that you aren't necessarily an unredeemable nerd if you like this subject, that you can be and they're watching you about that. And if you go to Rate My Professor, you realize that they're convincing about that. And if they're trying to decide whether or not they like your clothing style, and so on and so on and so on. And I think that's really important to education. Even at, we'd like to think it is some neutral transmission of little blobs of information. I sort of, pow, I get them, like, some ecstatic transmission. But no, it's about people hanging out with other people, chatting, talking, reading each other's papers, slapping them on the wrist, that sort of stuff.
And Curtis, it's been said that the web isn't good at telling stories because it's so fragmentary. You can click from one thing to another, and you can go to sites in any order, and that therefore you're not getting a unified story.
Does that mean short stories can't exist? Anywhere. I mean, this is what you're talking about here, by being able to have these little short stories, and you're saying because they're not completing the experience, that's a problem?
Yeah, or even if say Trinity decided to, or say we have a whole decade of commemorations coming up in Ireland with the 1916 Rising and Irish independence, but if that story was told in a book, it would go from chapter 1 to chapter 10.
Right.
Whereas on the web, you can start at the end, you can then go to 1916 Rising, you can then go to the 1913 lockout. It would seem that the technology could be the enemy of narrative there.
Skip to the end of the book as well? Yeah. It's a really valid point. The books are the most interactive of all. You can read it in any order, backwards if you want.
I personally like to not read them. I stack them up by my bed, and I buy them, and that's it just costs money.
But you feel less guilty because you bought it.
And any day now, I'm going to learn how to stay up later or wake up early or something.
I mean, I think if you're trying to understand something, chances are there are many sources of information, and if you're really lucky, the hyperlinks within that document will allow you to connect to related topics that are deeper that may not be covered as well in that particular sort of essay that you're looking at. So I don't see it as a problem.
And probably you can get the whole story in without having to do it in an order. It probably doesn't matter where you start in on it, like joining a TV series after 10 episodes. You can still pick things up very quickly and things can make sense no matter. Curtis, when you look at the kind of the cutting edge of technology, where do you think things will go? Are we going to be at a point in 5 years' time where computer games will be so advanced that it'll be seen as an art form? You'll have award ceremonies for best new.
Isn't that already the case?
Oh, we don't take them seriously.
Oh, you mean like the equivalent respect of the Oscars?
Yeah.
Well, they're already a bigger business than the movies.
Do you see it as art?
Some parts of it are.
Yeah, there's a debate about that. I guess I'm with the people who say it doesn't really matter if it's art. It's ludic, it's play, and there are better and worse designed games. But if I can sort of jump to the I think one of the things that is happening is, in the late 90s, I was totally sucked into the idea that we were going to get sucked into the computer. If any of you ever saw Lawnmower Man, virtual reality, the big head-mounted thingies, the data gloves, the computer went from basically a one-dimensional interface, the calligraphic screen with the DOS prompt, to the two-dimensional. The next step was three-dimensional, and we'd enter it. And it didn't happen. What happened is the computing got so small that it entered our world. I think locative stuff. This is why, in some ways, the question is not, will we find narrative in the web? Because I think the web itself is going to become less and less important. What's going to become important are the locative apps on your cell phone. Loquacious is a really cool one where if you're someone who's a good tour guide, you can record a tour at various locations or about the Easter uprisings and like that, and then other people who have an iPhone can basically listen to it. They can see on the map. They can go from spot to spot. They can sort of hear your geospatial retelling of what happened, and that's stuff like that I think is going to be where things are happening.
And apart from computer games, Curtis, is there anything else that you think will change how the technology will change how the narratives are presented?
I used to have a saying in our group, no gratuitous technology, and this is across multiple companies I've worked for that are technology companies, because I think when we think about things, I always remind them about the fundamentals of what it is that we're trying to create as an experience. So I think when you're talking about things like these travel logs, there's all kinds of enabling technology that can help facilitate distribution and access, but fundamentally, if that nugget in there of that story, that little narrative is not compelling, it doesn't matter what the technology is.
Like Geoffrey, if every Trinity student, say, had an iPad, and they were going into a big lecture with their iPad, could you see how that could be used as a tool to further, I suppose, engagement? That they would respond, they could respond. The lecturer could ask a question, but when you ask a question now, students are, it can be a nerve-wracking thing in a big group to put up your hand or to say something. Whereas with that, you could
see the polling of everything.
You could poll everything. You could.
So, right now, do you guys have clickers? So, in large lectures in Canada now, you force the students to buy this $15 clicker, and then you can put up these multiple choice questions, and people click. It's a great way to take attendance and,
see how much they're getting.
It can be done poorly and badly. It's sort of drill and kill for lecture style stuff. And of course, if you really want to sleep in, you give your clicker to your friend, and you get these people with 15 clickers in there. What I would say though is I don't think what's going to change is so much the iPad. I think what we're going to get, and I don't know if you have them here, but in Canada we have these wedding banquet halls, which are these super flexible, large spaces with tables that can be configured for different wedding styles. They have surfaces all around them that can be projected on. So when you talk to people, for example, who do problem-based learning, they can have 200 people in one of these wedding things, and they've divided everybody into teams of 10, and they're working on a problem, and then the prof and the TA are traveling from table to table. Each table has a projected surface they're working on, and maybe there's one iPad that has the control for that projected surface. I think that is what we should be playing with. I'm not saying that that's going to take off, but the banks of rows in a seat, I don't think the iPad's going to make any difference to. And I'm not saying this will cease to happen or that it's bad, but the traditional lecture style, I don't think that's going to be changed. What's going to be changed is this more problem-based, project-oriented, challenge-oriented learning, and we're going to start using the types of spaces that commercial outfits use for weddings. What if we did learning by partying? You start by planning the party you're going to have when you learn something, and then you reverse engineer it. What do I have to do to get to the point where I can have the history party?
And also it means that we stay in a job.
Yes.
It's not all. Because, Curtis, isn't that a danger or a fear that if you create something like the Worldwide Telescope in each area, that then you don't, once the people do their bits for it, mm-hmm. the end user can navigate it without really needing any human contact?
I think there's two things you're talking about. I think that the Worldwide Telescope is an interesting example of how we can build a common resource, which is a virtual version of the universe, but make it really easy for professors from Harvard or Caltech or other places to create these lectures in the context of the sky. So in other words, it makes it easy to provide access to people. We have people from every country in the world to be able to hear a lecture from Harvard about, say, star formation. And I think that capability is really, really important, sort of democratizing access. But the other half of your question, which was, I forgot because I was thinking about
the human element, then.
Losing the human element of it. I think to this wedding banquet idea, I think one of the things that technology can enable you to do is get away from the mass lecture instruction, which is, I think, not particularly productive for everybody, but things perhaps more like the Khan Academy, where Saul Khan is kind of an expert in everything, but he does these short 3 to 10 minute lectures on specific topics, and the nice thing is about it, if you didn't get it, you can watch it over again. And then what the teacher does is provides the context and the interaction in a much smaller group of students, and sort of helps facilitate the activities in the wedding room on a project basis. So I think the larger lecture thing is really going to go away, because why would you have a lecturer be up there when you can have the best lecturer in the world explaining sort of the concept to you, and if you have issues with how to understand those are things you can deal with locally and individually and much more productively.
Very good. Okay, we might take some questions from the audience. Does anyone have anything they want to ask Curtis or Geoffrey about narrative, about these new technologies, the future, maybe the future for some of the old media?
Hey.
Yeah.
It's a quick one. It might be old technology, and to Curtis, I kind of apologize for a slight competitor's reference, but thinking about Apple's little textbook initiative and trying to turn the textbook, which may be a bit of a, haggard old thing, into something a little more modern. What's your thoughts on where the whole allowing people to basically collaboratively offer textbooks comes into things?
Collaboratively authored textbooks?
I might have given too much credit there on collaborative, but at least a mass produce or mass author textbooks.
Well, I think the iPad is a pretty wonderful device, and what Apple's trying to do with enabling books on the iPad, I think is pretty great too. I think their licensing is kind of problematic, but that's going to be worked out at some point soon. I mean, anytime you see kids in high school, at least in junior high, you see their backpacks that weigh like 20 or 30 pounds. So, that is just going to be a huge important thing too. But I think the ability of anybody to be able to write textbooks is also a really, really good thing too. There's so few publishers, and the markup of them are huge, and they make so much money. And I don't know if there's any publishers in the audience, but I think the opportunity for what happens on the internet, the best quality content can reach people. Having a platform like that is a good thing, whether it's Apple or not.
And Curtis, you were involved with the early electronic books, companies like Voyager, and then was it Criterion. So you saw the potential 20 years ago.
20 years ago, we did something called Expanded Books in 1991, when the first Mac PowerBook came out. So we had about 100 ebooks, and they're particularly wonderful, I think, for certainly for search and for annotation and those kinds of things. I'm not sure the value was necessarily there for fiction, but certainly on nonfiction it was particularly useful. And I think some of those ideas are certainly coming back now, both in what Apple's doing and some other folks in ebooks too.
Very good.
Thank you for the question.
Yes.
Thanks. You talked quite a bit about the uptake or non-uptake of technology in education circles, whether it be Trinity or elsewhere. Just wondering, I mean, the potential of technology we've known about for years, the response has been, incredibly slow recently. So we're talking about the Laura Ingalls Wilder test. If you brought her back, she certainly recognized what a classroom was like now. She mightn't recognize her doctor's surgery or elsewhere. Just wondering why you think that might be, and maybe how it might change, or should it change indeed?
So my pet theory is that most of the technology essentially has just been changing the textbook. It has not been changing the human relationship. And, even when I was a kid, there was the problem was never access to information. I could always get plenty of information. The problem was being motivated and having it contextualized. And I think that is still a very human relationship. And that's why, and I'm okay with that being a good thing. If there's a place where technology will change stuff, it's that those human relationships might not have to take place in a physical site. So more and more American kids are getting tutored by people in India. You can now get someone with a master's in mathematics to tutor your kid over Skype. So that's a place where the human relationship hasn't changed. It's just been it's someone further away. And if I were going to talk about what we should worry about is the sort of the outsourcing and almost global education market. University of Phoenix, experiments like that where they aren't getting rid of the instructor, they're not automating the instructor, they're just changing who that instructor is. In the case of Phoenix, a lot of their instructors don't have PhDs. They're coming out of industry. And a lot of students want that. A lot of my students in new media, they sort of go, well, you've never made anything that somebody bought. Why should I listen to you? They want Curtis. They want somebody who's from industry. So that's my sense, is that human thing. The other thing is a lot of what higher education is. In the States, for example, the elite schools are partly about finishing school. They're partly about hanging out and drinking too much with other people in a very safe campus where, by and large, you can't fall out of windows. And then you skip class. And I don't think that's going to go away. I think youth will choose to hang out with other youth and drink too much for a long time.
So you think the schools of the future will have all the instructions on the computer, but it's a place to drink beer, hang out, and socialize?
I think there's going to be a class that can afford to send their children to a residential school where they reside together and spend a lot of time. I went to one of these schools, and I can remember having philosophical arguments, at breakfast, at lunch. It was great. It was intellectually fantastic. In Canada, we can't afford, we're public schools, we don't have residences for students all 4 years. They might have a resident, they might be in residence the first year, and then they live in apartments or stay at home. And that's just a different economic arrangement, but the people who can afford it still do send their kids to small colleges where they have that experience. And that will continue. Harvard's not going to disappear.
Yeah.
I wonder, would the questioner himself have a suggestion about how we might use the technology differently?
I don't know. I mean, a lot of the, a lot of education, is focused on things like learning management systems and virtual learning environments and ties this in. But essentially, I suppose the model of teaching and learning hasn't changed an awful lot. It's still about somebody who stands in front and gives a lecture or whatever. You talked a bit about, getting students involved in the wedding banquet hall and that kind of more. So perhaps it's more to do with the pedagogic models that we employ, and indeed even opening up a lot of our, you talked about, actually it's interesting, the Irish Times today has a big comparison about the number of people with PhDs across the country at all the different colleges, and there's very little talk about what their knowledge of how to teach or how to instruct students, and there's not an awful lot of talk about that. So perhaps it is to do with the pedagogic models, I don't know.
Yeah, I think we've maybe been a little unimaginative in how we've used the technology. Like in the old days, a lecturer would leave a folder with the documents by their door, and a student would take turns taking it and photocopying it. Well, now we just put all of those documents on the virtual learning environment for them to download. But you might as well just give them the folder. It saved paper for you, but it hasn't changed how they get the data, the information, or what they do with it, and there's no interaction there. So we have Trevor from...
I'm a librarian of this parish, and as a librarian we're struggling, and we're getting somewhere with coping with the new technology, but we still talk, and you talk about electronic books, electronic journals, in the same way as we used to talk about horseless carriages, I believe. And what I'm wondering is, what are your views of what will be the format of new research output be in the future, and how might the librarians of the future look, how will they mind it, how will they manage it, and how would it be used? So I think we will be moving away from electronic books, whether it'll be electronic something else, and what is that something else, do you think?
I'll take a little bit and you can finish. I think in the past 2 or 3 years there's already been some movement in publishing to start publishing interactive papers. I think the first 3D PDF of an astrophysics paper was done a couple years ago, where you could look at the data in a chart and bring up different data sets and look at them in 3D. But data sets are getting to be larger and larger, certainly across the sciences, and just reducing the results to specific charts and graphs, which are abstractions of the data, is somewhat limiting. And I think in the future, publishing may involve pointers to hosted data sets where the results are rendered and interpreted in this representation, but other people that look at the paper can go in and get access to that same data, try and reproduce the same results, perhaps with different techniques. So I think publishing will evolve that way, and there's also will be the opportunity to have this also online exchange and debate and discussion about these papers going forward.
I think you're right about data sets. It's not just something that's happening in the future. We have the Social Science Humanities Research Council of Canada did a study. They looked to see how many of the social science projects that produce data sets that they paid for, in which by their rules were supposed to be deposited somewhere so that they would be available. Of the 800 they had funded, they could only find 8. So the electronic texts that are being created, the social science, the geospatial data sets, even NASA, has stuff on tapes that they're having a hard time reading. And that's the stuff, the sort of high research stuff. Then you think of HyperCard and the thousands of HyperCard stacks that historians, language instructors, all sorts of people produce these little things. The interactive stuff is really gnarly and difficult to preserve and to maintain access to. And I think that will keep librarians, if they are interested in it, that'll keep you happily employed for decades. And it's just getting worse and more complex. I would say the other thing, though, that I've seen that is very successful is the lines between the library and the bookstore eroding. Libraries beginning to think of themselves as social learning spaces, not as places to keep people's grubby fingers from books. But instead, it's sort of, well, we put it all on the bookstore, and you can either sign out the book, or you can, if we don't have it, you can buy it and then give it to us afterwards, or you can rent it, or you can have coffee right next to it, doing what like we get Starbucks inside bookstores now. If the commercial people can put coffee stores in bookstores, the libraries have decided they can do that too. And it's that sort of social learning space that I think is making a lot of Canadian university libraries really cool places and very desirable. In fact, they're one of the few organizations that are interdisciplinary, that cross all faculties, and that, in some sense, are trying to support students across all disciplines, and that gives them a real opportunity to do stuff that individual departments can't do.
Okay, so that's coffee in the library now. Cross on. I have actually a question before we take a few more about. We've been talking about third level students and the adult world. What about the under 10s and how new technologies can be used there? Because some parents have concerns about their children having their portable DVD players and playing a lot of video games. But I was reading about some and not reading as much as they would have in the past. But then I was reading about how some technologies were used for a thing like a SAGE program, where they're interacting with a figure on the screen who's helping them through the narrative, and that's instructive. It's almost like that they have a teacher or an adult in the class with them. Can this be a way of addressing some of those concerns that parents have about child literacy and about maybe an overemphasis on some kinds of technology?
I'm on the advisory board for public broadcasting in the U.S., and about 2 or 3 years ago we were thinking about, because their major audience is either really young kids, K through probably 6th grade, and then older adults, and how to sort of serve the younger audience. And we were looking at, they had for years done a number of educational web areas which are safe for kids that would have educational games, but they found that a lot of the time that the kids were spending were with parents in other places. So we were looking at what potential devices might work for that, and we also ended up concluding that creating exercises for kids that would run on parents' iPhone when they're traveling with their parents to do things that are educational and fun and stimulating and those kinds of things. So that was something they started a couple of years ago, and they released a number of them.
Okay, Geoffrey, do you think
speaking as a parent, I think the television is more of a problem than interactive media. And if you do what we did, is we bought our kids all sorts of mind-improving educational CD-ROMs, and I think after the first Christmas, our kids came to view them a little bit like socks. They would sort of go, "Oh, thank you, Dad. I always wanted, the complete history of the Titanic with 3D something or other," and then they'd never touch them, with some exceptions. And then, of course, we struggled with the period when the kids began to get really into World of Warcraft and so on like that. And so always television seemed to be more of an issue than interactive games.
You mean the quality of television?
Yeah, I just think the TV is, is meant for, and it. And in some sense, you don't even choose what you're going to watch. It's just being pushed at you and something like that. So, but in terms of, I think this is where that textbook initiative and the iPad, it seems to me Apple is trying to position itself so that they can sell the iPad into schools and sell these animated textbooks and so on like that. And there were actually, when our kids were small, there were all sorts of great CD-ROMs of books. You know, they'd take Dr. Seuss books, and then the book would be there. You'd flip the pages, but everything was interactive and so on like that. And I think this the living books, and I think this is where Apple is going. They're trying to position themselves to get into that market so that upscale Montessori schools will buy iPads and have all these books there and stuff. What I'm interested, have any of you seen on I think it's on YouTube, there are iPad apps for your pets. Like, you know, one where a little fish swims around and your cat sort of swipes at it and so on like that. And we need to think about how we educate our pets too. You know, we have a responsibility here.
Do they understand narrative in the same way as we do, or they know the beginning, the middle, and
they have a short attention span, probably.
Yeah, you being there.
Thinking about your remarks about television, and I guess I'd look at it differently. I think about it differently. I think that the world is becoming more increasingly televisual. The internet is becoming far more visual a medium, and there is a migration away from text, except for what I would observe among the 16-year-old gamers, which is almost like a form of Esperanto that they now have, which you can see them playing online. It doesn't matter what the country of origin is for the other gamer. They're communicating in abbreviated, annotated English text language that is commonly understood. Doesn't matter what your original native speech is. So that's a fascinating development, I think, in terms of linguistics that's been driven by this type of social media. Very interesting. And as you start to see Microsoft bringing television programming narrative structures, which are not terribly far away from CD-ROM structures either, into these online gaming communities, you see an emergence of a form of entertainment, information, skill learning, kinetic skill learning, that is a completely new place. So I think when we think about narrative now and how people learn, I'm not sure that we can even really imagine how fast that space is evolving for the type of almost autodidactic forms of learning that people are experiencing in these media spaces now. It's no longer, and Patrick, I'm because you're a historian, because the timeline's really important to you. And I know when you're thinking about things like 1916, you're thinking about, well, it started here, and this is the background. And when I think about that and how you might think about that in a media space, it's far more like a scrapbook. It's far more like a collage of different things, pieces of text, lots of imagery, movies, film. It's very different. I saw something like it in Columbia in their media unit with their research, where the idea was that you, as a research student, you could produce it's like a collection of everything that you had pulled together to inform the basis of your thesis, and your PhD was a navigation through all of that reference collection. But anybody else could take a very different pathway and do a different PhD through, in fact, the same collection, however enhanced by their inputs as well. So I think we really need to spring forward quite a bit, and I'm afraid we're going to have to embrace television very broadly. We have a different experience here, though, I think, being beside the BBC and also the Open University in terms of maybe North American programming for television. I think television is starting to dominate much more, and television narratives are dominating much more.
But your idea about having these collectives of assets, I think, is a really interesting one. With our digital humanities class, we use something called rich interactive narratives, which is essentially bringing different media assets together to be able to tell stories with them. And I think the interesting thing is that we're able to come to the point where we have these large repositories of assets about particular events that people can produce their own sort of documentary, their point of view about that others could too, and have them have the same form as what we're used to as television, even though it's dynamically generated video. That's an exciting future.
So did you, we had in the 60s and 70s, everyone was convinced that television or video was going to become central to education. Scarborough campus of the University of Toronto, every classroom had big TV monitors put into it. And then nothing. Nobody used it. And so So I guess I want to agree with you that the visual is very important. In fact, now that flat screens, you get on a bus and they've got screens all over the place. You go into stores, they have flat screens all over the place. So the visual and the interactive visual is important, but broadcast TV is perhaps what it seems to be passing away. Instead, it seems that people's relationship with the visual, they're less and less willing to have something broadcast at them with advertisements, and more they want to pull stuff and choose what they're going to watch and be able to interact with it. So in that sense, I would agree that the visual is more important, and there's narrative to it. And when it comes to learning, there's a class of students, there's a class of students or kids who will get into, let's say, World of Warcraft, and then will form a clan, and the clan will build a website, and they are writing all sorts of stuff, they're reading all sorts of stuff, they're fanatical about beating the other clans and about getting to level 57 and so on like that. And there's a tremendous amount of learning how to learn that happens there. You used the word autodictate. It's actually amazing to watch these. Often they're groups of young men, or boys really, and it's amazing how they learn to learn on their own and then teach each other and discipline each other. It can have some unintended side effects, but that is absolutely terrific. And I actually have a memory of something very similar, but with board games. So I don't think it's something new to video games. I think groups of kids will form around some hobby or something like that and really enjoy learning how to learn, and we should encourage that. Sometimes you worry that your kids are too programmed. Is this a complaint here? People worry in North America that kids are too programmed and don't have enough time for their own play and their own self-discovery and learning how to learn on their own.
Okay, lots of questions. Okay,
I have to share something from my personal life. 3 days ago, I finally got the new iPhone, and for somebody who's a total Apple fan, sorry about that. My old one died, and then I had this. I had already read about it a lot, as every other Apple freak would do, and so I knew Siri and I knew what it was about, this personal assistant. And then I started playing with it, and I did, ask the stupid questions that I already read that people had asked. So are you a man or woman? No, I haven't been assigned a gender and this and that. But then came a surprise, which is when I asked Siri one question with, I don't know, do you lie? Do you have sex? And it doesn't matter what it was. She answered, presumably, she answered, that's an interesting question, but shouldn't we get back to work? When I asked that same question again, showing it to a friend, she gave me a completely different answer and saying something, don't be ridiculous, etc. Now, why am I telling you all this? First of all...
I'm intrigued by the questions you're asking, sir.
Yeah, of course. I have lots of free time, obviously. So, So, this is my dissertation, really. No. So, the fascinating thing here is, first of all, Siri has a sense of humor programmed into her. Right? So that was obviously a conscious decision. There was probably some market research there that said people want to associate, people like their gadgets, they need to have a personal relationship with them. And this was a brilliant move. The second interesting thing is that it was programmed in such a way that giving different answers at different times create this illusion of an actual person who has moods and changes their moods, etc., etc. But what is troublesome to me now when I think about it is that is this really just a terrible ploy to get us even more personally attached to these gadgets? And is there a danger that we are actually being even more sucked into the, dark and ever more sinister world of Apple that, they used to be so nice and now we're realizing the other story. Anyway.
The wealthiest company on earth.
Yeah. So anyway, if you have some comments about that, I'd love to hear.
No real comments, but we'll all take out our iPhones later.
I think one of the interesting challenges that we're facing now is the challenge of choice. You know, when I was growing up, there was a limited number of, I could choose what books I wanted to read, but there weren't a lot of TV channels and something like that. Now you have to choose. Are you going to tweet? Are you going to keep a blog? Are you going to be on Facebook? And that is what we sort of have to teach our kids, or one of the things that they are learning on their own. They are learning. My daughter will, when she finishes term, she will fire up Facebook, but during term she turns it off because she wants to get her work done and something like that. She's learning to sort of choose which poison to take at which time. So in this question of being sucked into the mob, I think youth naturally adapt, and they adapt by, some get, addicted to it and, waste all sorts of time, and some just learn to turn it off at some times and to use the ones that are appropriate to their lifestyle. And has it really been that different? Maybe now we have to make choices about electronic media, but we probably had choices like what pub to go drink at. I don't know. There were other things that were probably equally difficult.
Are there any gender issues in terms of boys and girls dealing with these technologies in different ways, or men and women then in the adult years?
But there certainly are a lot of stats around computer games. Certain games are more popular among girls. Think of the Tamagotchi. That was very popular among girls. Some boys too. Then on the other hand, the first-person shooters, Call of Duty, Modern Warfare, not that popular. There are. What's interesting statistically is that more and more, the gamers are getting old. The average age of a gamer is getting older and older. It used to be that playing games was something you did when you were young, and then you stopped doing it as you became mature. Have you ever seen those photographs of college students back at right after World War II or something like that? They all look so mature. They all have jackets, they had nice little ties and something like that. They were of an age when they had to grow up. Nowadays, kids don't have to grow up. They can keep on playing computer games until they're 60, and we see that in the statistics. They are not. The society is telling them it's fine to stay a boy. And you know who we blame? We blame Bill Gates. Bill Gates is the hero. I mean, he was this very visible role model for staying young and fascinated by technology and so on like that. I'm sorry, just
Steve Jobs as well.
Steve Jobs as well, but Bill always seemed younger. Steve Jobs was, he went off and did Zen Buddhism, and he seemed to be pretending to be mature. But Bill was.
Well, Bill had a tie that he can never, and didn't cut his hair very well, and Steve never wore shoes, and he never showered. So I think they were all just so kind of boys.
Susan, you wanted to get in.
A comment and then a question. But speaking about learning and learning styles, I mean, obviously I teach a lot of technology now, and I'm amazed how different my classroom is, that I have changed my whole teaching style and noticed how wonderful it is, even in the workshop we did the other day, how much students learn from each other. And it's not something you have to teach anybody, but people just begin to work differently together. That's being mediated by the technology, but it's not because of the technology. And I'm sure that one could do that in classrooms teaching other subjects. It's just with technology, it's makes it much more easy, or makes much more sense to teach in small groups where people are doing things. But my question goes back to what you were talking about, Patrick, and that we talked about again about 1916. I was also thinking, we do have a wonderful opportunity here. There are so many anniversaries coming up. There's a decade of anniversaries, and how do we tell those stories? It's true if you think of the web as a place that you go in and come out of again, but if you think of it as this almost mediated space where you go in and there are these vignettes, these stories, these kind of globs of information that you go in and you become captivated and interesting. Within that, there are many narratives. We hear about about how the anniversary in 1966 was commemorated. I mean, it is possible to have many points of views. Is there a right point of view? Is there one that should be the predominant? I think those are different kinds of issues, aren't they? Of narrative and storytelling and making things more of not a priority, but kind of the authenticated version.
And the collage idea suits.
I think so, and I think that might be a way of thinking of telling these many stories. Also, in one of my classes, we're working on a Great War diary, but it is not the kind of diary you would normally work on, because it's written by a mother to a son that went missing in action. They were a well-to-do Catholic family, and he was on the Eastern Front. And it's a diary of the home front, as it happened. The Rising happens during that period. So it allows for these different kinds of stories to be privileged in different ways. That if you're writing your book from start to finish, you have to leave out many stories because there's just not enough room. So how we present it doesn't make it any easier, because now you have a multitude of stories, and how do we guide people through those experiences? So I don't know if you have some ideas, because I think we do have some wonderful opportunities coming up now.
It sounds like you have a lot of different sources about the uprising, and it seems to me it's a lot like when something like, I'd say when 9/11 happened, there was so many different stories happening in different places, all on this sort of kind of crazy time frame, and nobody really sort of got the big picture until sort of later. But if you were recreating the uprising sort of today, where would those letters be? Would they be on a blog? What would the news be like? The different stories, depending on what channel you were watching or which newspaper you had, would have different pieces of information from different people. And it would sort of be like what it was like back then. You didn't have necessarily a complete picture of some student walking by. She didn't know that this other thing was going on a few blocks away. I think it would add a sort of visceralness, and also to give you a sort of a temporal sense of the unfolding of events.
Sorry, something you say?
Thank you. Since you were talking about digital narratives, I wanted to ask a question about audiences, and more specifically, how difficult it is to select audiences and to define the audience, the targeted audience, and in which way this definition affect our digital narratives in terms of layering, organization, and presentation of our narrative.
Is that too?
Either of you.
I think that's a real issue in terms of your audience, and certainly the level of sort of whether they're a kid or whether they're adult, and their level of expertise has always been a problem when you're creating educational material. I think, as an example, I'll pick Worldwide Telescope. We have narratives that are sort of designed for adults, and some other that are created by kids for kids. And we weren't exactly sure the best way to allow the system to automatically sort of figure out who you are, because that if people were logging in, then we could sort of know their profile, and then we could make it easier for them to suggest things that might be relevant for them. Mm-hmm. But because we didn't want to capture any personal information, especially with kids, we're not allowed to do that. That we just sort of had to sort of punt on that one. But if you could do that, that's how I would do it. Sort of with at least some form of proxy for identifying what your interests are.
Okay, thank you.
So I think, first of all, something like the web allows people to reach an audience. The cost of reaching an audience is relatively little. It's the cost of creating the content, putting it up on server, and anyone who has access to the internet can access that. Whereas, and Curtis was talking about this with textbooks. The cost of reaching an audience through textbooks, you have to print 5,000 copies, you have to distribute them out, and then if you find out you're wrong. So that leads to a second phenomena, that you can dynamically engage an audience, and in a sort of dialogical fashion, you can adapt. You might think your audience is this, and then you discover, in fact, that your audience is a little bit different. The third thing that we're now able to do, which I think is very exciting for those of us in the academy, is we can crowdsource. So we can enter into a relationship where the audience, it's not a broadcast relationship of I'm the expert on X, I build the website, and you read it and admire it and maybe go sign the guest book or something like that. Instead, I can sit there and say, we've got a project, for example, on Ukrainian folklore, and so we've got all this audio, we put up clips of audio, and people in the community who know Ukrainian, both in the Ukraine and in Canada, in Alberta, there's a big Ukrainian-Canadian community, they can go in and they can translate the folklore, they can transcribe it. So now they become co-researchers. That's a different relationship of audience. It is structured, but crowdsourcing, all sorts of projects have been done with crowdsourcing, and I think this is going to be vital for the relationship of the humanities to the broader public. That the old sort of we've got the archives, we translate the archives into accessible books, and then people out there read them and should appreciate our knowledge, the knowledge coming from the doctors at Trinity. I think that is being turned over, and instead it's our job is actually to make the archival, the whole bandwidth accessible to the community and bring them into the researcher, make them co-researchers. And those are the people who are then going to are going to buy into the fact that public funds should continue to pay for humanities education.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I thought maybe then, just as a final wrap-up question, if we were to do a SWOT analysis then of these new technologies and the narrative concept, what are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that you mentioned some of the possible threats, but Curtis, maybe to start.
Can I do a weakness?
Yeah.
I think. And I can say this because I work for a technology company, but in any technology, there's always the challenges you have with technology, both in terms of what its lifespan is, both of the medium and the material, or the devices that it takes to be able to access some of that stuff. Like many of the CD-ROMs I did 15, 20 years ago, you can't read. Websites that I did with VRML 10 years ago, you can't access anymore. So I think viability and thinking about really generalized industry standards are really important as you create content up there and share it to ensure that it can essentially migrate to whatever standards come in the future. So that's both a weakness and something that we have to pay a lot of attention to.
Okay. Geoffrey.
So I think the strength is reach. That it bypasses traditional means of distribution, something like that. I agree entirely about the weakness of, at the end of the day, making a cool new technology doesn't cut it. I've been part of a games team. One of the things that we've been hammering our heads on, we built these cool systems, we have all this technology, we don't know how to design a compelling game. Now, it's not quite the same thing as telling a good story, but we don't know how to be entertaining. And you don't just learn how. You don't learn how to write a paper overnight. You don't learn how to become entertaining or tell stories. And the weakness, the good stories, the good entertainment, opportunities, locative stuff. I would say getting the computer out of off the desktop into pockets, out and around, onto whatever. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank Susan Tryman for organising this and the Long Room Hub for hosting us today, and a special thanks to our two guests who I think have given us wonderful insights into this whole area, Curtis Wong of Microsoft and Geoffrey Rockwell of the University of Alberta, both of Trinity temporarily or for the moment, but thank you very much, Curtis.
Thank you for a great job.
Thank you. That was brilliant, thank you.